The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail winding through the crimson cliffs of southern Utah Territory, where Gabriella Mercer's life hung in precarious balance beneath the crushing weight of her overturned wagon. Blood trickled down her temple as consciousness flickered like a candle flame in strong wind, her desperate cries growing weaker with each passing moment. The year was 1883, and in this unforgiving wilderness between Kanab and the settlement of Tropic, death often came swiftly to those who traveled alone. Gabriella had been making the journey to start a new life as the schoolteacher in Tropic, having left behind the comforts of St. Louis after her father's passing left her without means to maintain their modest home. A widow at 26, though barely having known marriage before influenza claimed her husband of 3 months, she had embraced the territory's offer with determination. The wagon, loaded with her books, teaching supplies, and meager belongings, represented everything she owned in the world. Now it pressed against her lower body, trapping her in the rocky soil beside the trail. The accident had happened quickly, a rattlesnake startling her horse, causing it to rear and bolt, dragging the wagon sideways until it tipped over a shallow embankment. The horse had broken free, disappearing into the distance, leaving her alone with the afternoon heat climbing toward unbearable heights. "Help!" she called again, her voice barely audible now even to her own ears. The pain in her legs was becoming numbing, and she fought to stay awake, knowing that surrendering to sleep might mean never waking again. The sound of hoofbeats reached her ears, so faint she thought perhaps she was already dreaming. But then came the thunder of a galloping horse, growing louder until it stopped abruptly nearby. "Hello, is someone there?" A man's voice, deep and urgent. "Here," Gabriella managed weakly. "Please, help." Boots hit the ground hard, and moments later a tall figure appeared in her narrowing field of vision. The sun behind him cast his face in shadow, but she could make out broad shoulders and the silhouette of a cowboy hat. "Madam, don't you worry now, I'll get you out." The stranger knelt beside her, assessing the situation. "Name's Xavier Novak. I'm gonna lift this wagon off you, but I need you to tell me if anything feels broken first." "My legs. I can't feel them properly," Gabriella whispered, clinging to consciousness. "Please hurry." Xavier stood, positioning himself at the edge of the wagon. Gabriella watched in disbelief as the man braced himself, muscles straining beneath his dusty shirt as he gripped the wagon's frame. "On 3, he said through gritted teeth. 1, 2, 3. With a mighty heave that seemed impossible for even his considerable frame, Xavier lifted the wagon just enough for Gabriella to drag herself from beneath it. The moment she was clear, he carefully lowered it back to the ground, then immediately turned his attention to her. "You're bleeding," he said, kneeling beside her and examining the cut on her temple with surprising gentleness for hands so weathered. "Can you move your legs now?" Gabriella tentatively shifted her limbs, relief flooding through her as feeling returned with painful pins and needles. They weren't crushed, just trapped. She tried to sit up but fell back with a gasp as pain shot through her side. "Something else is wrong, though." Xavier's expression grew grave as he noted her pallor. "Might be internal bleeding, we need a doctor." He glanced at her overturned wagon, then back to the road leading toward Tropic. "Town's still 15 miles from here. My horse can make it in under an hour. Please don't leave me," Gabriella whispered, genuine fear in her voice. Xavier hesitated, then made a swift decision. "I'll make you comfortable, then ride for the doctor. I'll be back before you know it." He gathered blankets from her wagon, creating a shaded area against the base of a nearby rock formation, then carried her to it with careful movements. "Water," he said, pressing his canteen to her lips. "Small sips. I've got to go now if we want the doctor here before nightfall." "Thank you," Gabriella murmured, her eyelids growing heavy. "I don't know how to repay you." "Stay alive," Xavier said simply, then mounted his horse in one fluid motion. "That'll be payment enough." As consciousness slipped away, the last thing Gabriella saw was Xavier Novak riding away, dust billowing behind him as he pushed his horse to a full gallop toward Tropic. When Gabriella next opened her eyes, the light had changed. The merciless afternoon sun had softened to early evening gold. She blinked, trying to orient herself. The pain in her side remained, but her head felt clearer. A noise nearby caught her attention, hoofbeats again, but more than one horse this time. 2 riders approached, and she recognized Xavier's broad-shouldered silhouette immediately. Beside him rode a smaller man carrying a black medical bag. "She's awake," Xavier called to his companion as they dismounted. "That's a good sign, isn't it, Doc?" "Indeed it is," the older man replied, hurrying to Gabriella's side. "Miss, I'm Dr. Frederick Sullivan. This young man nearly killed his horse getting to me, said a lady was in dire need of medical attention." "Gabriella Mercer," she managed, wincing as she tried to shift position. "I was on my way to Tropic. I'm to be the new schoolteacher." "Well, Miss Mercer, Doctor," Sullivan said, opening his bag. "Let's make sure you live to teach those children, shall we?" As the doctor examined her, Xavier gathered firewood and started a small campfire nearby. The light was fading fast, and the temperature would drop quickly once the sun disappeared behind the red cliffs. "3 broken ribs," Dr. Sullivan announced after a thorough examination. "And a nasty cut on your head, but your pupils look normal. I don't think there's internal bleeding, but those ribs need binding and you shouldn't be moved far tonight." "My wagon," Gabriella began, but Xavier interrupted. "Already taken care of. While the doc was checking you, I righted it and secured the contents. Horse is gone, though. We'll have to get you to town another way." "I'd say our best option is to camp here tonight," the doctor suggested. "In the morning, Mr. Novak can take you to Tropic on his horse. I've brought pain medication and can bind those ribs properly." Gabriella nodded gratefully, though the prospect of spending a night in the wilderness made her uneasy. "Don't worry, Miss Mercer," Xavier said, reading her expression. "I'll keep watch. Nothing's going to harm you tonight." As Dr. Sullivan administered laudanum and wrapped her ribs with practiced efficiency, Gabriella studied Xavier in the flickering firelight. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way. His face was too weathered, his nose slightly crooked from an old break, his dark hair too long beneath his hat. But there was something compelling about his gray eyes, something trustworthy and solid. "Mr. Novak," she said once the doctor had finished, "you've saved my life today. I can't thank you enough." Xavier shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Dr. Sullivan interjected, packing away his supplies. "Not everyone could have lifted that wagon. And certainly not everyone would have ridden as hard as you did to fetch me." He turned to Gabriella. "This man pushed his horse to its limits, arrived in town covered in dust, barely stopping long enough to ask where to find me." Xavier waved away the praise. "The lady needed help. That's all there is to it." Later, as Dr. Sullivan dozed by the fire and Gabriella lay beneath blankets from her wagon, she watched Xavier sitting vigilant at the edge of their small camp. The laudanum had dulled her pain but left her mind clear enough to wonder about this man who had appeared like an answer to a prayer. "Mr. Novak," she called softly. "Won't you rest?" He turned toward her, his profile outlined against the star-filled Utah sky. "Been on the trail long enough to go without sleep when needed, Miss Mercer. You just focus on healing." "What brings you to these parts?" she asked, finding that talking distracted her from the pain that persisted despite the medication. Xavier was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Passing through, heading north to Wyoming territory." A cowboy, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Used to be, rode with cattle drives out of Texas for years. Now I'm between occupations." "A drifter then?" He looked at her directly then. "Some might call it that. I prefer to think of myself as a man looking for the right place to stop." "And where might that be?" Gabriella asked, genuinely curious about this enigmatic man. Xavier turned back to his watch. "I'll know it when I find it, Miss Mercer." The morning brought pain but also clarity. Gabriella woke to find Dr. Sullivan checking her bandages while Xavier prepared coffee over a small fire. The smell was heavenly, and she realized she hadn't eaten since before the accident. "How's our patient this morning?" Xavier asked, approaching with a tin cup of steaming coffee. "Better than she has any right to be," the doctor replied. "Those ribs will take weeks to heal properly, but she's strong. No fever, which is a good sign." Xavier helped Gabriella sit up, supporting her back with gentle hands that belied their strength. "Think you can manage some hardtack softened in coffee? It's not much of a breakfast, but it'll keep your strength up." "Thank you," she said, accepting the simple fare gratefully. As she ate, Xavier and the doctor discussed logistics. "I need to get back to town," Sullivan said. "Mrs. Patterson's time is near and her last baby came quick. I shouldn't be away too long." "I'll see Miss Mercer safely to Tropic," Xavier assured him. "We'll take it slow, but we should arrive by midday." The doctor nodded, then turned to Gabriella. "The school board's been preparing the teacher's cottage for your arrival. It's modest, but it has a good bed where you can recover. I'll check on you daily." After Sullivan departed, Xavier set about breaking camp with efficient movements. Gabriella watched him, wondering why a man so capable would choose a rootless existence. "What will happen to my wagon?" she asked as he helped her to her feet. "I'll come back for it once you're settled," he promised. "Get your belongings to town." "That's too much to ask after all you've already done," she protested. Xavier looked at her with those steady gray eyes. "It's no trouble. Besides, you'll need your things to start teaching once you're healed." Mounting Xavier's horse proved challenging with her injuries, but he lifted her with such care that the pain was minimal. When he swung up behind her, one strong arm circled her waist to keep her secure, careful to avoid her broken ribs. "Ready?" he asked, his voice close to her ear. Gabriella nodded, acutely aware of his closeness as they set off toward Tropic at a gentle pace. The morning was cool, the sky a brilliant blue above the red rock formations that made this corner of Utah territory so distinctive. Despite her injuries and the precariousness of her situation, Gabriella found herself noticing the beauty around them. "Have you been through this area before?" she asked over her shoulder. "Once or twice," Xavier replied. "It's changing." "When I first rode through 5 years ago, Tropic was just a dream in the eye of a few Mormon settlers. Now there's a proper town taking shape." "Is that why they need a school teacher?" "Families are putting down roots. Where there are children, education follows or should." There was something in his tone that made Gabriella curious. "Did you attend school, Mr. Novak?" he chuckled, the sound rumbling against her back. "For a few years. My pa was a ranch hand in Texas. Ma insisted I learn my letters before I learned to rope cattle. She'd be pleased to know I'm delivering a schoolteacher safely to her post." "Would be?" Gabriella asked softly. "She passed when I was 14. Fever took her one winter." "I'm sorry, I lost my mother young as well." Gabriella hesitated, then added, "and my father just this past winter. It's why I accepted this position. There was nothing left for me in St. Louis." Xavier's arm tightened slightly around her waist, not a romantic gesture, she knew, but one of human understanding. "Fresh starts can be good things, Miss Mercer. Please call me Gabriella. After saving my life, I think formalities seem rather unnecessary." "Gabriella," he said, her name sounding different in his deep voice. "Then you must call me Xavier." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of the horse's gait lulling despite the occasional jolt of pain through Gabriella's ribs. The sun climbed higher, warming the air around them. "May I ask you something, Xavier?" she said eventually. "You can ask. I might not answer." "Why Wyoming? What's waiting for you there?" He was quiet for several moments. "Nothing specific. Just heard there's good land available for those willing to work it. Thought I might try my hand at having a place of my own." "You're tired of drifting," Gabriella observed. "Maybe." "Been doing it since I was 16. That's 12 years of seeing new horizons. Perhaps it's time to stake a claim somewhere. Is there no one who'd miss you, a wife or—" She trailed off, suddenly embarrassed by her forwardness. Xavier chuckled again. "No wife, no sweetheart waiting. Just me and Thunder here." He patted the horse's neck. "What about you? You mentioned your father passed, but was there no one else in St. Louis? No suitor? I was married briefly, Gabriella admitted. James died of influenza 3 months after our wedding. That was 2 years ago. We'd barely begun to know each other, really. I'm sorry, Xavier said simply. Gabriella appreciated that he didn't offer platitudes. It was more the idea of marriage than actual love between us, if I'm being honest. My father arranged it before his business troubles began. James was kind, but we were strangers in many ways. They crested a gentle rise, and suddenly the settlement of Tropic lay before them, a collection of sturdy buildings nestled in a green valley that stood in stark contrast to the red rock wilderness surrounding it. Irrigation ditches brought water from nearby Bryce Creek, creating an oasis in the desert landscape. There it is, Xavier said. Your new home. Gabriella felt a mixture of trepidation and relief. This remote settlement represented her future, a place to rebuild her life. But arriving injured, dependent on the kindness of a stranger, was hardly the strong first impression she'd hoped to make. It's smaller than I expected, she said, but growing. See that frame going up near the general store? That'll be the permanent school building. For now, I believe classes are held in the church. You seem to know a lot about the town for someone just passing through, Gabriella observed. Xavier didn't respond directly. Let's get you settled. The sooner you're resting properly, the sooner you'll heal. Their arrival in Tropic caused immediate stir. People emerged from buildings to watch them pass, and by the time they reached the small whitewashed cottage designated as the teacher's residence, a small crowd had gathered. Dr. Sullivan was among them, having already returned from their campsite. Word travels fast in small towns, Xavier murmured as he carefully helped Gabriella dismount. Miss Mercer? A portly man with an impressive mustache pushed through the onlookers. I'm Harold Peterson, head of the school board. We've been expecting you, though not quite in this condition. Doctor Sullivan has informed us of your unfortunate accident. I'm grateful to be here at all, Mr. Peterson, Gabriella replied, leaning heavily on Xavier's arm. If not for Mr. Novak's intervention, I fear I wouldn't have survived. Then we owe this gentleman our thanks, Peterson said, extending his hand to Xavier. The education of our children is of paramount importance to our community's future. Xavier shook the offered hand but seemed uncomfortable with the attention. Just happened to be in the right place at the right time, sir. Nonsense, Peterson boomed. Heroism should be recognized. You must join us for supper tonight. We were planning a welcome meal for Miss Mercer at the church, but it can serve to honor you both. Before Xavier could decline, Dr. Sullivan stepped forward. I think Miss Mercer needs rest before any celebrations, Harold. Those ribs won't heal if she's paraded around town her first day here. Of course, Peterson agreed quickly. Perhaps tomorrow then, once our new teacher has had time to recover somewhat. I need to retrieve Miss Mercer's wagon and belongings, Xavier said. It's still out on the trail where the accident occurred. I'll organize some men to accompany you, Peterson offered. Xavier nodded his thanks, then turned to Gabriella. Let's get you inside. The teacher's cottage was indeed modest, just 2 rooms. A main living area with a small kitchen and a separate bedroom, but it was clean and had been prepared with obvious care. Fresh wildflowers sat in a jar on the small table, and the bedsheets looked newly laundered. It's perfect, Gabriella said as Xavier helped her to the bed. The women of the community have stocked your pantry, Dr. Sullivan informed her, and Mrs. Peterson will be by later to help with anything you might need. Everyone is so kind, she murmured, the events of the past day catching up with her as exhaustion set in. Rest now, Sullivan instructed, measuring out another dose of laudanum. I'll check on you this evening. As Gabriella settled against the pillows, Xavier lingered in the doorway. I'll head back for your wagon now, should return before dark. Thank you, Xavier, she said, her eyelids growing heavy. For everything. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed almost shy. Rest well, Gabriella. The next few days passed in a blur of pain, medication, and visits from curious but well-meaning townspeople. Gabriella was touched by their generosity. Women brought meals. Men offered to repair a squeaky door and loose floorboard in her cottage, and children shyly presented her with drawings to welcome their new teacher. Xavier had successfully retrieved her wagon and belongings, working with several men from town to transport everything safely to Tropic. But to Gabriella's disappointment, he had remained scarce since then, appearing only briefly to inquire about her health before disappearing again. She found herself watching the window, hoping to catch sight of his tall figure passing by. On the fourth day after her arrival, as Gabriella sat in a chair by the window feeling marginally stronger, a knock came at her door. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Peterson with the midday meal she had promised to bring. Instead, Xavier Novak ducked through the doorway, hat in hand. He'd cleaned up since she'd last seen him. His dark hair was trimmed, face freshly shaven, and he wore a new-looking blue shirt that brought out the gray of his eyes. "You're looking better," he said by way of greeting. "And you're looking quite respectable," Gabriella returned with a smile. "I was beginning to think you'd left town." Xavier shook his head, "had some business to attend to, and thought you might need space to settle in without a stranger hovering." "You're hardly a stranger anymore. Please sit." She gestured to the chair across from hers. "Dr. Sullivan says I'm healing well, though it will be weeks before I can begin teaching. The town has been very understanding." Xavier sat, placing his hat on his knee. Small communities usually pull together when needed. It's one of their strengths. "Have you ever lived in such a place?" Gabriella asked. "A small town like this, not since I was very young. Ranch life was isolated. Closest town was half a day's ride." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Actually, that's part of what I came to tell you. I've decided to stay in Tropic for a while." Gabriella tried to hide her pleasure at this news. "What about Wyoming?" "Wyoming's not going anywhere," he said with a slight smile, "and there's work here. The livery stable needs help, and I'm good with horses. Figure I could save some money before heading north." "That's wonderful news," Gabriella said, too enthusiastic perhaps, because Xavier looked at her curiously. She added more carefully, "I mean, it will give me the chance to properly thank you for saving my life." "No thanks necessary." He shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with gratitude. "There's something else. The school board is concerned about you living alone while recovering. Mrs. Peterson offered to stay with you, but I know how smothering well-meaning ladies can be." Gabriella laughed, then winced as her ribs protested. "Mrs. Peterson is lovely but very talkative." "Exactly. So I suggested an alternative. The wagon you were traveling in, it's sound, but the horse is gone. I have a good team I use for heavy hauling. Once you're well enough to travel, I thought I might drive you around to meet the outlying families who can't easily bring their children to town for school." Gabriella blinked in surprise. "That's incredibly thoughtful, but won't it interfere with your work at the livery?" "I've worked it out with Mr. Dawson. I'd be free 3 afternoons a week." Xavier leaned forward slightly. "The board thinks it's a fine idea. Some of these homesteads are quite isolated, and the children are missing education entirely." "You seem quite invested in education for someone who described his own schooling as minimal," Gabriella observed. Something flickered in Xavier's eyes, a memory perhaps. "I know what it's like to wish for learning and not have access to it. Books were scarce on the ranch, and after Ma died, there was no one to encourage reading." The vulnerability in this admission touched Gabriella deeply. "Then I accept your offer, Xavier. It would be a wonderful way to meet my students and their families before formal classes begin." Relief crossed his features. "Good, that's good." He stood abruptly. "I should let you rest now. Dr. Sullivan would have my hide if he thought I was tiring you. Will you come tomorrow?" Gabriella asked before she could stop herself. "Just to visit, I mean." Xavier paused at the door, a smile softening his weathered features. "If you'd like, I would." After he left, Gabriella sat by the window for a long time, watching the activity in the street outside with a lightness in her heart she hadn't felt in years. Perhaps this new beginning would be more significant than she had dared to hope. True to his word, Xavier visited the following day bringing a book of poetry he'd found at the general store. "Thought you might be bored," he explained, seeming almost embarrassed by the gesture. "It's perfect," Gabriella assured him, genuinely touched. "Would you like me to read some aloud?" They spent a pleasant hour that way, with Gabriella reading and Xavier listening attentively, occasionally asking questions about words or references he didn't understand. It established a pattern for the days that followed. Xavier would visit in the evenings after finishing at the livery, sometimes bringing small gifts. Fresh berries from the hills, a wildflower that had caught his eye, once even a set of carved wooden animals that a local craftsman had made. "For your classroom," he explained when he presented the wooden menagerie. "Children learn better with things they can touch." Each day, Gabriella grew stronger. 2 weeks after the accident, Dr. Sullivan declared her well enough for short excursions, though he cautioned against any strenuous activity. "Perfect timing," Xavier said when she shared the news. "There's a social at the church tomorrow evening. Nothing fancy, just music and refreshments, but it would get you out of these 4 walls." "I'd love to go," Gabriella said, then hesitated. "Would you accompany me?" Something warm flickered in Xavier's eyes. "I'd be honored." The social was Gabriella's first real introduction to the community as a whole. Though many residents had visited her cottage during her recovery, seeing them gathered together gave her a better sense of Tropic's character. It was indeed a small settlement, with perhaps 30 families total, but it had the energetic feel of a place on the rise. Xavier stayed close to her side throughout the evening, introducing her to people she hadn't yet met and making sure she didn't overtax herself. Gabriella noticed the curious glances some of the townswomen gave them, and the knowing smiles exchanged when Xavier brought her punch or found her a comfortable chair. "They're matchmaking in their minds," she whispered to him after catching Mrs. Peterson and another woman whispering behind their hands while looking their way. Xavier chuckled. "Small towns run on gossip and good intentions. Does it bother you?" "No," Gabriella admitted. "Does it bother you?" His eyes held hers for a long moment. "Not in the least." As they walked slowly back to her cottage under a star-filled sky, Xavier offered his arm for support. Gabriella took it, appreciating both the physical assistance and the warmth of his presence beside her. "Thank you for tonight," she said as they reached her door. "It was wonderful to finally meet everyone properly." "They're good people," Xavier replied. "Hardworking, honest, the kind who look out for their neighbors." "Is that why you're staying? Because you like the community?" Xavier was quiet for a moment. "Partly," he finally said. "And partly because, well, because I found something worth staying for." The implication hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to acknowledge it directly but both aware of its presence. "Well," Gabriella said softly, "I'm glad, whatever the reason." Xavier reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was gentle, almost reverent. "Rest well, Gabriella. I'll see you tomorrow." As spring deepened into summer, Gabriella's ribs healed completely, and she began making preparations for the school term that would begin in September. Xavier proved true to his word about the wagon trips to outlying homesteads, driving her to meet families who lived too far from town to attend the social gatherings. These excursions became the highlight of Gabriella's week. Away from the watchful eyes of Tropic's residents, she and Xavier found a freedom to talk openly about their pasts, their hopes, their views on life. She learned that beneath his quiet exterior lay a quick mind and thoughtful perspective shaped by years of observing the world from horseback. For his part, Xavier seemed fascinated by Gabriella's education and her passionate beliefs about learning. "You truly think anyone can improve their circumstances through books?" he asked on one such trip, as they traveled back to town after visiting a family with 5 children living in a 2-room cabin. "I do," Gabriella said firmly. "Knowledge opens doors that might otherwise remain closed. Those children we just met, they deserve the same opportunities as any child in Boston or New York." And you're determined to give them that chance. I am. It's why I came west, why I took this position, to make a difference. Xavier looked at her with such admiration that Gabriella felt warmth rising to her cheeks. You're a remarkable woman, Gabriella Mercer. The compliment hung between them, and Gabriella found herself wondering, not for the first time, what it would feel like if Xavier were to kiss her. But though their friendship had deepened considerably over the past months, he had made no overtly romantic gestures beyond the occasional touch of his hand to hers, or that gentle moment when he'd tucked her hair behind her ear. July brought scorching heat to the Utah Territory, and with it came troubling news. A group of cattle rustlers had been operating in the region, hitting isolated ranches and creating tension among the settlers. Xavier, who had taken to joining the men who discussed such matters at the general store each evening, brought the news to Gabriella. The sheriff from Kanab came through today, he told her as they sat on the small porch of her cottage, watching the sunset. Says these rustlers are organized, possibly 5 or 6 men working together. They've hit 3 ranches in the past month. How dreadful, Gabriella said. Is there concern they might come here? Xavier nodded. Tropics small but growing. Some of the outlying farms have good stock. The sheriffs asked for volunteers to form a patrol. A cold feeling settled in Gabriella's stomach. And you volunteered. It wasn't a question, but Xavier answered anyway. I have experience tracking, and riding night patrol isn't new to me. He hesitated, then added more softly, You're worried. Of course I am, Gabriella admitted. These men sound dangerous. It's probably nothing. Just precautionary. Xavier reached over and took her hand, a gesture so natural now that neither of them remarked on it. But it means our trips to the outlying homesteads should wait until this situation is resolved. I don't want you traveling outside town until we know it's safe. The way he said, we warmed Gabriella despite her concern. Over the past months, something had definitely shifted between them, a partnership forming so gradually that she couldn't pinpoint when exactly Xavier had become essential to her happiness. When do you start this patrol? She asked. Tomorrow night. I'll alternate with some of the other men. Every 3rd night, most likely. Gabriella squeezed his hand. Promise me you'll be careful. Xavier looked at her, his gray eyes serious in the fading light. I promise. The following weeks brought increasing tension to Tropic. The rustlers struck a farm just 20 miles away, stealing a dozen cattle and shooting the farmer when he tried to intervene. Though he survived, the news sent ripples of fear through the community. Xavier and the other men patrolling reported strange tracks and signs of riders passing near town at night, but no direct confrontation occurred. Gabriella found herself watching the clock anxiously on the nights when Xavier patrolled, unable to sleep until she saw him ride past her cottage at dawn, returning safely from his watch. Though he never complained, she could see the toll the long nights were taking on him, the shadows under his eyes, the increased quietness of his usually reserved demeanor. One particularly hot evening in early August, Gabriella sat on her porch hoping to catch any breeze, a book open but unread in her lap. Her mind kept returning to Xavier, who was patrolling the north section tonight. The sky to the west had turned an ominous yellow-gray, suggesting a summer storm brewing in the distance. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up hopefully, but instead of Xavier, she saw Harold Peterson riding toward her cottage at a brisk pace. Miss Mercer, he called, reining in his horse. Have you seen Novak today? Not since morning, she replied, a flutter of worry rising in her chest. Why, what's happened? Peterson wiped sweat from his brow. One of the outlying families sent word they spotted strangers on their property this afternoon. Armed men. We're gathering a group to investigate, but Novak's the best tracker we have and no one's seen him since midday. He mentioned checking the South Trail, Gabriella said, rising to her feet. Said there were tracks there yesterday that concerned him. Peterson nodded grimly. We'll check there first. Don't worry yourself, Miss Mercer. I'm sure he's fine. But as Peterson rode away, Gabriella couldn't shake the cold dread settling over her. She paced her small cottage, unable to focus on anything but worry for Xavier's safety. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. The storm was approaching faster than expected. When the first drops began to fall, Gabriella made a decision. She couldn't sit idle any longer. Donning her shawl, she hurried to the livery stable where she knew Xavier kept his wagon and team. Mr. Dawson, the livery owner, looked surprised to see her. "Miss Mercer, you should be inside with this weather coming on." "I need Xavier's wagon," she said firmly. "I believe he may be in trouble." Dawson frowned. "Peterson and the others are already looking for him. Best let them handle it. They're checking the South Trail, but what if he went elsewhere? What if he's injured?" The possibility had been haunting her all evening. "Please, Mr. Dawson." "I need to look for him." Perhaps it was the desperation in her voice or the determination in her eyes, but Dawson relented. "At least let me hitch up the team for you, and take this." He handed her an oilcloth slicker. "Storm's going to be a bad one." Minutes later, Gabriella was driving the wagon through Tropic's Main Street as rain began falling more heavily. She wasn't entirely sure where she was going, but something told her to check the East Trail, the route they often took to visit the outlying farms during their excursions together. Xavier had mentioned tracks there several days ago, though he hadn't considered them recent enough to be concerning. Lightning split the sky as she left town behind, illuminating the landscape in brief, brilliant flashes. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the very ground, and the horses grew skittish, requiring all of Gabriella's concentration to control. The rain intensified, turning the dirt road into mud that sucked at the wagon wheels. "Xavier." She called into the howling wind, knowing it was futile but unable to stay silent. "Xavier, where are you?" She had traveled perhaps 3 miles when a lightning flash revealed something on the trail ahead, a dark shape that didn't belong. Gabriella urged the horses forward, her heart pounding in her chest. As she drew closer, she could make out the form of a horse lying on its side, and beside it, a motionless human figure. "Xavier," Gabriella cried, pulling the wagon to a halt and leaping down without regard for the mud or rain. She ran to the fallen man, dropping to her knees beside him. It was indeed Xavier, lying unconscious in the mud, blood matting the hair at his temple. His horse appeared to have broken a leg, probably due to the poor visibility and treacherous footing from the storm. "Xavier, can you hear me?" Gabriella touched his face, relief flooding through her when she felt warmth against her palm. He was alive. Xavier's eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly. "Gabriella," he murmured, confusion evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you," she said, helping him sit up slowly. "What happened?" He winced, touching his head. "Storm came up faster than I expected. Lightning spooked my horse. We went down hard." He looked over at his injured mount and grimaced. "Poor animal." "Can you stand?" Gabriella asked. "We need to get you back to town to Dr. Sullivan." Xavier nodded, though his face was pale beneath the streaks of mud. With Gabriella's support, he managed to get to his feet, swaying slightly. "The rustlers," he said suddenly. "I found sign of them. They're planning something tonight using the storm as cover." "The others are already looking," Gabriella assured him, helping him toward the wagon. "Peterson gathered a group. Our priority is getting you to safety." The journey back to town was slow and harrowing. The storm intensified, with lightning striking so close that Gabriella could smell the scorched earth. Xavier drifted in and out of consciousness beside her, worrying her deeply despite his assurances that head wounds always bled dramatically. They were perhaps half a mile from Tropic when a flash of lightning revealed 3 riders directly in their path. Gabriella pulled the team to a halt, her heart leaping into her throat. The men were strangers, rough-looking, with bandanas pulled up to cover the lower half of their faces. "Well, what do we have here?" The leader called over the storm, his voice carrying a menacing edge. "Bit late for a drive, ain't it, madam?" Xavier straightened beside her, instantly alert despite his injury. "Keep driving," he muttered to Gabriella. "Straight at them, they'll move." "Are you sure?" she whispered, terrified by the pistols visible at the men's sides. "Trust me, when I say now, snap the reins hard." The leader urged his horse forward. "Why don't you step down from there, lady? We just want to talk." Xavier tensed beside her. "Now," he hissed. Gabriella snapped the reins hard, and the team lunged forward. Simultaneously, Xavier produced a revolver from beneath his coat, a weapon Gabriella hadn't even known he carried. He fired a warning shot over the riders' heads, causing them to scatter in surprise. The wagon barreled through the space where they had been, the horses running at full speed now, driven by fear of the gunshot and storm. Gabriella held onto the reins with white-knuckled determination, hearing shouts and another gunshot behind them. "Don't stop," Xavier ordered, turning to fire another shot behind them. "Those are the rustlers. They were heading for town." They thundered into Tropic minutes later, the commotion immediately drawing attention despite the storm. Men emerged from buildings, weapons ready when they heard Xavier shouting about rustlers. "They're right behind us," he called. "3 of them at least." Peterson and several other men immediately mounted up, riding out to intercept the threat while others helped Xavier down from the wagon. Dr. Sullivan, alerted to the commotion, appeared to take charge of the injured man. "Get him to my office," Sullivan ordered 2 men who supported Xavier between them. "Miss Mercer, you should come too. You're soaked through and likely in shock." Gabriella followed numbly, the events of the past hour catching up with her now that the immediate danger had passed. In Sullivan's office, she waited anxiously while the doctor examined Xavier's head wound. "Concussion, certainly," Sullivan pronounced after cleaning away the blood. "But the skull seems intact. You're a lucky man, Mr. Novak. A fall like that could have killed you." "Wasn't luck," Xavier said, his eyes finding Gabriella across the room. "She found me." Sullivan looked between them with knowing eyes. "Yes, well, our schoolteacher seems to have quite a talent for dramatic rescues, though driving out alone in that storm was foolhardy at best." "It was worth the risk," Gabriella said quietly, meeting Xavier's gaze. Later, after Xavier had been bandaged and given medicine for pain, they sat alone in Sullivan's waiting room while the town buzzed with activity outside. The storm had passed, and word came that Peterson and the others had captured 2 of the rustlers, though the 3rd had escaped. "You could have been killed," Xavier said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Going out in that storm, facing those men." "So could you," Gabriella countered. "Yet you patrol every 3rd night and carry a gun I didn't know about." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Some habits from my drifting days are hard to break." His expression grew serious again. "But Gabriella, why did you come looking for me? Peterson and the others would have found me eventually." Gabriella took a deep breath, knowing the time for half-truths and careful words had passed. "Because the thought of losing you was unbearable. Because these past months have shown me that what I feel for you goes far beyond friendship or gratitude." Xavier reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "When I was lying there in the mud, drifting in and out of consciousness, all I could think about was you. Not whether I'd live or die, but whether I'd see you again, whether I'd get the chance to tell you." "Tell me what?" Gabriella prompted when he hesitated. "That I love you." The words were simple, direct, just like the man himself. "That I stayed in Tropic because from the moment I lifted that wagon off you, I knew I'd found something I'd been searching for without even knowing it." Joy bloomed in Gabriella's chest, warming her more effectively than any fire. "I love you too, Xavier. I think I have for quite some time now." He leaned forward slowly, mindful of his injured head, and finally his lips met hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. It was tender, reverent almost, his hand coming up to cup her cheek as though she were something precious. When they separated, Xavier rested his forehead gently against hers. "I was heading to Wyoming to find a place to belong," he murmured. "Turns out it wasn't a place I was looking for at all." The weeks that followed brought significant changes to Tropic. With the rustler threat diminished, the community returned to its normal rhythms. though with heightened vigilance. Xavier's actions during the confrontation with the outlaws, along with Gabriella's brave rescue, elevated them both in the town's esteem, not that either sought such recognition. As September approached, bringing with it the start of the school term, Gabriella found herself busier than ever preparing lessons and organizing the newly completed schoolhouse. Xavier, now fully recovered from his concussion, proved an unexpected asset, building shelves for books and a sturdy desk for her use. "You're quite talented with woodworking," she observed one evening as they walked together after supper at the boarding house. Their courtship had become official to the surprise of absolutely no one in Tropic. "Where did you learn such skills?" "My father," Xavier replied, taking her hand as they strolled. "Before he took to drinking, he was a fine carpenter, taught me the basics when I was young." "You've never spoken much about him before," Gabriella said gently. Xavier sighed, his expression thoughtful rather than pained. "Not much to tell, that's good. After my mother died, he found comfort in whiskey. Wasn't violent, just absent even when he was there. I left home at 16, found work with cattle drives, never saw him again." Gabriella squeezed his hand. "I'm sorry. Don't be, it shaped who I am." He paused there walking, turning to face her. "Made me value certain things, like honesty, reliability, being present for those you care about." The intensity in his eyes made Gabriella's heart quicken. "You excel at all those things." "I try." He took both her hands in his. "And I want to keep trying, Gabriella, with you." "What are you saying, Xavier?" she asked, though something in her knew what was coming. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the last light of day, a simple gold band. "I'm saying I love you. I'm saying that I've found where I belong, and it's wherever you are. I'm asking if you'll marry me." Tears sprang to Gabriella's eyes, happy ones that blurred Xavier's earnest face. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you." His smile was brilliant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It was slightly loose, but that hardly mattered as he pulled her close for a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. The next day, they shared their news with the town, receiving enthusiastic congratulations from all quarters. Dr. Sullivan was particularly pleased, declaring with a wink that he'd known from the moment Xavier had ridden into town demanding his help for an injured woman that something significant was beginning. "When will the wedding be?" Mrs. Peterson asked during an impromptu celebration at the general store. Xavier and Gabriella exchanged glances. "We thought perhaps October," Gabriella said, "after I've settled into teaching, a small ceremony." "Nonsense," Peterson boomed. "This calls for a proper celebration the whole town will want to attend." "The whole town is only 30 families," Xavier pointed out with a smile. 30 families who have watched this romance unfold from the beginning," Sullivan added. "I don't think you'll escape with a small ceremony, my friends." He was right, of course. As September passed and October approached, wedding preparations took on a life of their own. The women of Tropic took charge, planning decorations for the church, organizing a feast, and helping Gabriella create a wedding dress from fine fabric ordered specially from Salt Lake City. Xavier, meanwhile, had a project of his own. With the help of several men from town, he was building in addition to Gabriella's cottage a larger bedroom, a proper kitchen, and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the structure. "A teacher deserves a proper home," he told her when she protested that the cottage was perfectly adequate. "And so does her husband." The transformation of the modest dwelling mirrored the transformation in their lives, something simple becoming something more substantial, built with care and attention to detail. Xavier revealed a talent for design that surprised even him, incorporating clever storage solutions and windows positioned to catch the best light. "You could have a future in building," Gabriella observed as they inspected the nearly completed addition 2 weeks before the wedding. Xavier considered this, looking around at what he'd created. "Maybe, there's certainly need for it with the town growing. Is that something you'd consider, instead of working at the livery?" He nodded slowly. It feels right, creating something lasting. His eyes met hers, building foundations. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, a perfect October morning with aspen trees on the distant hillsides showing gold against the red rock. The entire town had indeed turned out for the occasion, filling the small church to capacity and spilling onto the grounds outside. Gabriella, dressed in a gown of ivory silk with lace trim, waited nervously in a side room with Mrs. Peterson, who had assumed the role of surrogate mother for the occasion. "You look beautiful, dear," the older woman said, adjusting Gabriella's veil, "and so happy. It does my heart good to see it." "I never expected this when I accepted the teaching position," Gabriella admitted. "I thought I was coming here to start a new chapter alone." "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Mrs. Peterson said with a smile. "Sometimes He sends us exactly what we need when we least expect it." "Or who we need," Gabriella murmured. The ceremony itself was simple but deeply meaningful. Xavier, standing tall in a new suit before the pastor, watched with wonder as Gabriella walked toward him on Harold Peterson's arm. The look in his gray eyes, love, admiration, and a touch of disbelief at his good fortune brought fresh tears to Gabriella's eyes. They spoke their vows clearly, promises to love and honor each other through whatever life might bring. When Xavier slipped the gold band onto Gabriella's finger, this time perfectly sized, his hand trembled slightly, the only outward sign of emotion from this usually composed man. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the pastor declared, beaming at the couple. "Mr. Novak, you may kiss your bride." The cheer that erupted from the congregation as their lips met seemed to shake the very rafters of the small church. Xavier and Gabriella broke apart, laughing at the enthusiastic response of their friends and neighbors. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and more food than the small community had seen gathered in one place before. Through it all, Xavier kept Gabriella close, his hand often finding hers as though reassuring himself that this happiness was real. As the sun set and the party continued under lantern light, the newlyweds slipped away to their freshly completed home. Xavier paused at the door, then swept Gabriella into his arms with a grin. "I believe this is traditional," he said, carrying her across the threshold. Inside, they found the cottage transformed not just by the new addition, but by the thoughtful touches of the townswomen, fresh flowers on the table, new curtains at the windows, and a quilt on their bed that Gabriella recognized as a community project, with squares contributed by many different hands. "Welcome home, Mrs. Novak," Xavier said softly, setting her on her feet but keeping her within the circle of his arms. "Say that again," Gabriella requested, her hands resting against his chest. "Mrs. Novak," he repeated, his voice dropping lower. "My wife, my heart." "And you are my husband," she said wonderingly. "The man who lifted a wagon to save a stranger's life. The best decision I ever made," Xavier murmured before claiming her lips in a kiss far more passionate than the one they'd shared in the church. This was a private kiss, one that spoke of the night to come and all the nights after a lifetime of loving and being loved. The years that followed brought changes to Tropic and to the Novaks. Xavier established himself as a builder, eventually opening a carpentry shop where he crafted furniture as well as constructing homes for new arrivals. Gabriella's school flourished, growing from 12 students that first year to over 30 by the time their first child was born, a son they named James, after Gabriella's father. 2 years later, a daughter joined their family, Elizabeth, with her mother's spirit and her father's steady gray eyes. And 2 years after that, another son completed their family, Daniel, a curious child with a gift for working with his hands that delighted his father. As the children grew, they often heard the story of how their parents met, how Xavier had happened upon an overturned wagon, lifted it single-handedly to free the trapped woman beneath, then ridden for a doctor to save her life. The children found it thrilling, a real-life tale of heroism that happened to result in their existence. "Did you know right away, Pa?" James asked one evening as Xavier tucked him into bed. That you would marry Ma, Xavier smiled, ruffling his son's dark hair. Not right away. But I knew there was something special about her from the first moment. Sometimes life puts you exactly where you need to be, even when you think you're just passing through. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Gabriella with a journey back to the exact spot where her wagon had overturned all those years ago. The landscape had changed little, the red cliff still towering above the dusty trail, though the trail itself was now a more established road with regular stage service. Why here? Gabriella asked as they stood hand in hand, looking at the unremarkable patch of ground that had altered the course of their lives. Because I wanted to remember, Xavier said simply. How close I came to riding past, how easily we might never have met. Gabriella leaned her head against his shoulder. But you didn't ride past, you stopped, you lifted that wagon. And found everything I never knew I was looking for, Xavier finished, turning to draw her into his embrace. At 46, his dark hair was now threaded with silver, and lines had formed at the corners of his eyes, evidence of a life with much laughter and outdoor work. But his arms were as strong as ever as they held her close. I've been thinking, he said as they walked back to their wagon where their children waited, engrossed in a picnic lunch under the watchful eye of Mrs. Peterson's daughter, who had offered to accompany them on this journey. About expanding the house again. The children are growing and James will want his own room soon. Gabriella smiled, thinking of their home that had grown along with their family, no longer a modest teacher's cottage but a proper house, though still with the original rooms at its heart. What did you have in mind? A second floor. James could have the upper room with a view of the mountains. He's always drawing those peaks. He has your eye for detail, Gabriella observed proudly. And Elizabeth has your determination. Did I tell you she insisted on helping Mr. Sullivan set Billy Parker's broken arm yesterday? Not a hint of squeamishness, Xavier chuckled. She told me all about it, in rather graphic detail, I might add. That girl may follow Sullivan into medicine someday. And Daniel will build things, Xavier said with certainty. Better things than I ever could. You should see the model bridge he constructed yesterday. Ingenious design. They reached the wagon where their children greeted them with enthusiastic accounts of a lizard they'd discovered near the picnic spot. As Xavier helped them all into the wagon for the journey home, Gabriella was struck by how complete her happiness felt, a wonderful, ordinary happiness built day by day, year by year. That evening, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Xavier and Gabriella sat together on the porch that had been one of his first building projects. The night was clear, stars brilliant above the silhouette of the town that had become their home. You ever wonder about Wyoming? Gabriella asked softly. Where you were headed when you found me? Xavier considered the question, his arm around her shoulders. Sometimes, but not with regret. He turned to look at her, the moonlight silvering his features. I was looking for a place to belong, remember? Turns out I was looking for you instead. Gabriella smiled, leaning into his embrace. I'm glad you found me. So am I, Xavier murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. So am I. In the years that followed, Tropic continued to grow, though it remained a small community where everyone knew their neighbors. The Novak children grew up, each following their own path, James eventually becoming a surveyor for the expanding railway system, Elizabeth indeed pursuing medicine with Dr. Sullivan's enthusiastic mentorship, and Daniel joining his father in the building trade before establishing his own architectural practice in the growing city of Salt Lake. Xavier and Gabriella remained the heart of the community, he as a respected builder and town elder. She as the beloved schoolteacher who had educated 2 generations of Tropic's children. Their home, expanded several times over the decades, became a gathering place for family, friends, and neighbors, always with an open door and a ready welcome. And on quiet evenings, they still sat together on their porch, hand in hand, marveling at the journey that had brought them together, a chance encounter on a dusty trail, an overturned wagon, and the strength of a passing cowboy who had stopped to help a stranger in need. "The best decision I ever made," Xavier would say, echoing words spoken on their wedding night long ago. And Gabriella would smile, knowing it had been the best decision for them both, the beginning of a love story written across decades, built on foundation stones of courage, kindness, and the remarkable ways that fate sometimes intervenes to place us exactly where we need to be.